Welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to walk through core concepts in research ethics, focusing on how ethical principles guide research design, participant protection, and responsible decision making. Much of our decision will draw from foundational documents like the Belmont Report, as well as modern examples involving data and analytics, all of which are available on our course page on Canvas. Here are our objectives for today. First, we will distinguish research from clinical practice. Next, we'll review the three ethical principles outlined in the Belmont Report. Then we will discuss how these principles are applied in real research settings. Finally, we'll look at issues related to privacy, confidentiality, and handling sensitive data. Let's begin by watching this short video on basic ethical principles from the University of Michigan Medical School. And I'm going to share the link to this video on Canvas under the recording.
In the 1970s, in the immediate aftermath of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, today the Department of Health and Human Services, formed a special commission to focus on bioethics policy. Between 1974 and 1978, this commission issued numerous reports and recommendations, including a summary of principles and guidelines to govern human subject research and the work of institutional review boards throughout the United States. That summary, published in 1979 and to this day a cornerstone document in human subject research ethics, was the Belmont Report. The report begins by defining research and distinguishing it from clinical practice. The purpose of medical or behavioral practice, says the report, is to provide diagnosis, preventive treatment, or therapy to particular individuals. By contrast, the term research designates an activity designed to test a hypothesis, permit conclusions to be drawn, and thereby to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Next, the Belmont Report identifies three basic ethical principles that should guide researchers and IRBs in making the best ethical judgments in human subject research. Those three principles are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Respect for persons involves not only recognition of individuals' autonomy, but also protection of those individuals whose autonomy is limited, such as children or the cognitively impaired. Sometimes, ethical conduct involves balancing the recognition of an individual's autonomy and the protection of someone with limited autonomy. The Belmont Report presents the example of prisoners. As autonomous persons, prisoners may be entitled to participate in certain studies. As inmates, however, they may also face unusual kinds and degrees of influence. Researchers and IRBs must work diligently to ensure that the principle of respect for persons applies in just these sorts of special circumstances. The Belmont Report's second basic ethical principle is that of beneficence. In the report's use of the term, beneficence refers to every researcher's obligation to maximize benefits while minimizing risks. To illustrate the complexity of this obligation, the report offers the example of research involving children. By enrolling children in research, and thereby exposing them to some risks, researchers learn new and valuable treatments that will help other children in the future. The more significant the risk to subjects, however, the harder it becomes to measure that risk against the prospect of future benefit. This means that researchers and IRBs sometimes have to make intricate ethical decisions. The last of the Belmont Report's 3 basic ethical principles is justice. Justice involves fair distributions of both the benefits and the burdens of research. The report offers 5 formulations of just ways to distribute burdens and benefits. They are: to each person an equal share, to each person according to individual need, to each person according to individual effort, to each person according to societal contribution, and to each person according to merit. The report highlights some historical instances of unjust distribution of benefits and burdens. It cites a 19th and early 20th century pattern of conducting experiments on the poor for the sake of improved medical treatment for the wealthy. Additionally, the report mentions the non-consensual experimentation on prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, as well as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, a study sponsored by the U.S. Public Health Service, in which, over the course of decades, researchers deprived hundreds of poor black men of effective treatment for syphilis in order to analyze the natural progression of the disease. The Belmont Report's 3 basic ethical principles, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, represent 3 major categories of ethical decision-making in human subject research.
One of the most important distinctions in research ethics is understanding the difference between research and clinical practice. Research aims to produce the generalizable knowledge intended to apply beyond the individual participants. But clinical practice, in contrast, focuses on diagnosing and treating an individual patient. The goal is to benefit that individual, not to produce new knowledge. So you see the difference? This distinction matters because research requires additional ethical protections that everyday clinical practice does not. The Belmont Report is a foundational document in research ethics. It outlines 3 essential principles that guide ethical research involving human subjects. These principles are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, just as you heard in the recording, in the video. Each principle addresses a different aspect of protecting individuals and ensuring fairness in research. Let's briefly briefly define each of these principles. Respect for persons recognizes the autonomy of individuals and requires extra protections for people with diminished autonomy. Beneficence requires researchers to maximize possible benefits and minimize potential harms. And justice ensures fairness in distributing the burdens and benefits of research. We have talked about these earlier during the semester, and we had several examples of these. Next, Let's watch another short video again from the University of Michigan Medical School, illustrating how these three principles are applied in real research setting.
Having established the basic ethical principles, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, the Belmont Report examines three areas in which researchers and IRBs should apply those principles: the informed consent process, the assessment of risk and benefit, and the selection of human subjects. The report states, respect for persons requires that subjects, to the degree that they are capable, be given the opportunity to choose what shall or shall not happen to them. It then isolates three elements that it considers crucial to an effective and appropriate consent process: information, comprehension, and voluntariness. Researchers have a duty to ensure that they inform individuals about what their participation would involve, that those individuals understand the information, and, if they then decide to participate, that it is of their own free will, without undue influence or coercion. But even before researchers have begun obtaining subject consent, they will already have given careful thought to an assessment of the risk and benefits of the proposed research. This assessment is central to a complete grasp of a study's justification on ethical grounds. As the Belmont Report states, for the investigator, an assessment of risks and benefits is a means to examine whether the proposed research is properly designed. For a review committee, it is a method for determining whether the risks that will be presented to subjects are justified. For prospective subjects, the assessment will assist the determination whether or not to participate. The report goes on to discuss some of the difficulties of achieving a truly reliable assessment. Proceeding from a desire for what the report refers to as a favorable ratio, researchers and IRBs may struggle to find quantifiable ways to measure risk and benefit. Thus, says the report, there should first be a determination of the validity of the presuppositions of the research. Then the nature, probability, and magnitude of risk should be distinguished with as much clarity as possible. Finally, the report demands that research reflect at least 5 specific considerations. 1. Brutal or inhumane treatment of human subjects is never morally justified. 2. Risks should be reduced to those necessary to achieve the research objective. 3. When research involves significant risk of serious impairment, review committees should be extraordinarily insistent on the justification of the risk. 4. When vulnerable populations are involved in research, the appropriateness of involving them should itself be demonstrated. 5. Relevant risks and benefits must be thoroughly arrayed in documents and procedures used in the informed consent process. The Belmont Report concludes by outlining the ethical considerations that researchers should apply in the selection of research participants. Justice, according to the report, is relevant to the selection of subjects of research at 2 levels: the societal and the individual. Individual justice refers to every researcher's obligation to ignore personal biases in the selection of particular subjects. Societal justice is similar, but applies to broad categories of subjects and involves factors such as economics, sex, or culture. In the decades since the Belmont Report's original publication, U.S. agencies have enacted many detailed policies to ensure the highest possible standard of ethical research. The Belmont Report, however, is more than historic. It remains a concise, reliable summary of some of the basic priorities that continue to guide the work of researchers, institutional review boards, and all of those committed to ethics in research involving human subjects.
Earlier, we mentioned three main principles based on the Belmont Report: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. These three principles are put into practice through three major areas of application. First, informed consent, which ensures individuals understand the research and voluntarily choose to participate. Informed consent requires that participants receive adequate information, comprehend that information, and voluntarily agree to participate. Second, assessment of risks and benefits, which evaluates whether the study design appropriately protects participants. Risk benefit assessment occurs at multiple levels: by the Institutional Review Board, IRB, by the researchers, and by the participants themselves. And third, selection of subjects, which ensures fairness and avoids exploiting vulnerable groups. Proper subject selection prevents researchers from targeting or overburdening populations that may already be at risk. Now, let's watch the last part of the three videos that the Michigan University Medical School have shared. And now let's watch this short video on privacy and confidentiality in human subjects research.
Federal regulations require researchers and IRBs to make sure that studies include, where appropriate, adequate provisions to protect the privacy of subjects and to maintain the confidentiality of data. We use the term privacy in reference to individuals and their right to control what other people know about them and their interactions with others. Confidentiality refers in particular to the security of records and information about individuals. Privacy applies to people. Confidentiality applies to information. Protecting the privacy of your subjects and potential subjects involves choosing appropriate settings for all study procedures and discussions, including the informed consent process. Choose locations where people outside your study won't see or overhear your interactions. Avoid discussing study participation in public. It may be appropriate to let individuals contact you to talk about your study or to arrange a convenient and comfortable time to meet. Since some people are more private than others, make sure, case by case, that your privacy measures meet the particular needs and expectations of your study population. Confidentiality, an extension of privacy, relates to the data you gather about your subjects. Information you take from a subject's medical record is protected under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. The Office of Human Research Protections requires that you maintain the confidentiality of any information you collect from non-public records, as well as information you collect from subjects directly in the course of your study. The National Institutes of Health, NIH, address two key concepts relating to the confidentiality of research data. Those are sensitive information and identifying characteristics. Sensitive information includes anything that a subject may not want everyone to know. For example, genetic profile, sexuality, illegal behavior, mental health, and any information that could lead to stigmatization or discrimination. Identifying characteristics are details that might enable those outside your study team to recognize a subject. Examples of identifying characteristics include a subject's name, social security number, detailed physical description, and genetic profile. No one outside your study team should have access to the identifying characteristics that link your subjects to their sensitive information. Password protection and encryption software are useful safeguards when storing confidential study data on computers. Never use shared or public computers to view or store information about your subjects. To prevent internet hacking, store confidential data on computers not connected to the internet. Avoid storing study data on portable devices that are easily misplaced or stolen. In your study's informed consent document, you must explain to subjects how you plan to keep their information confidential. Indicate all parties who may have access to sensitive information, and describe the methods you will use to prevent others from gaining access to it. If your study does involve the collection of sensitive data, you may decide to apply to NIH for a certificate of confidentiality. This would protect subjects' sensitive information from court orders demanding access to your study data. Any researcher who plans to gather sensitive information about study subjects may apply to NIH for a certificate of confidentiality, including for research that is not NIH funded. Ethical research practice means protecting subjects and potential subjects' personal privacy, as well as the confidentiality of the information you gather about them.
Just as you heard, privacy and confidentiality are central to ethical research. Privacy is an individual's right to control what others know about them, including their behaviors, beliefs, and personal information. Confidentiality refers to how we secure and protect the information participants share with us. Two key concepts apply here: sensitive information, anything a participant may not want publicly known, and identifying characteristics, details that could reveal someone's identity to individuals outside the research team. Now let's take a look at a review question. Let's review the concepts with a question. Targets use of shopping habits to identify likely pregnant women is an example of descriptive analytics, diagnostic analytics, prescriptive analytics, or predictive analytics. Pause the video, think about it, and then come back. Assuming that you paused and thought and decided which one is the answer, Target's use of shopping habits to identify likely pregnant customers is an example of predictive analytics because it uses past behavior to infer personal characteristics or future outcomes. The purpose was marketing, not research, but the analytic method itself is predictive. Here is another review question. Privacy individuals and their right to control what other people know about them and their interaction with others, like people, and confidentiality is the, okay, this is not the question, sorry. Here it is. Sorry, I think I hit the wrong key on my keyboard. So another review question is, which of the three principles from the Belmont report would be violated if target's actions met the definition of research? Respect for persons, beneficence, justice. Assuming that you pause, thought about it, and you are ready to answer, if target's actions did meet the definition of research, the Belmont principle violated uh, uh, would be respect for persons because customers were unaware that their purchasing behavior was being analyzed in ways that revealed sensitive information. However, this activity likely does not meet the formal definition of research because the information was used for internal marketing, not to produce generalizable knowledge. Note that this case became complicated once the findings became public because the insights did in fact contribute to generalizable knowledge. This raises the additional ethical considerations, including issues of transparency, replicability, justice, and risk benefit assessment, topics we discussed in our previous lectures. So the answer is respect for persons. And does target use of consumer spending information to predict pregnancy for the purpose of advertising meet the definition of research? Probably not. Knowledge is not intended to be generalizable. To close, I want you to watch this TED Talk titled The Era of Blind Faith in Big Data Must End. The link is included on this slide and on Canvas. Uh, in this talk, Kathy O'Neill explains how algorithms influence major life decisions, such as who gets a loan, who receives a job interview, and who is approved for insurance. She calls harmful, unregulated algorithms weapons of mass destruction. So, as you watch, reflect on how algorithmic decision making relates to the ethical principles we've discussed today, especially respect for persons, fairness, and the protection of vulnerable groups.